Hello, everyone. My name is Micah Uetricht. I'm joined here by Rich Yeselson, and we're going to be discussing sort of both contemporary scene of American politics and questions of socialism and social democracy, but also sort of bigger questions, zoomed out questions. And I thought that Rich, me as an editor of a socialist magazine, and Rich as an editor of a different kind of socialist magazine, editorial board member of a different kind of socialist magazine, is actually a good way to approach some of these questions. So let's start with introductions. Can you present yourself to the people, Rich?
I will present myself to the people, comrade. My name is Rich Yeselson. Right now, yes, I'm a contributing editor to the venerable socialist magazine. I'm not going to put that in quotes. Dissent, which was founded by Irving Howe in the early 1950s. I also, these days, freelance write about labor, about history, books, different things like that. I'm writing a book myself about the causes and the consequences of the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act. And before I was doing all this, I worked in the labor movement for like 23, 24 years as a what they call a strategic campaigner. People who like sort of figure out different ways to kind of leverage and pressure corporations in organizing and contract defense. Long before that, I had an idea I'd be an academic and spend some time in graduate school. So I know that world too.
Great. And I am a managing editor at Jacobin magazine. I wrote a book a few years ago called Strike for America, Chicago Teachers Against Austerity, about the Chicago Teachers Union, its strike in 2012. And also have a background in the labor movement. Worked as a union organizer for a few years before writing stuff full time. And as I said in the beginning, I wanted to do this conversation with you, Rich, for a little while because in the grand scheme of things, I don't think you and I are very far apart in terms of how we see politics. We're both leftists of one stripe or another. I think you would identify as a social democrat. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I identify as a democratic socialist. The words are so similar that people, social democrat versus democratic socialist, like you're just switching the two words around. What is the difference between these things, and why does it even matter? So I think on a political spectrum, we're sort of very close to each other, but there are some differences there, and the differences are worth talking about. Maybe mostly just for what they can say about, in the moment when socialism is on the rise in America, it's a useful conversation to have about what are the differences between these two philosophies. So we're here to debate, to illuminate, not to destroy the others. I'm not here to denounce you as a social fascist or something like that. You get enough of that on Twitter, so you don't need me to do that for you. Right. So,
running dog.
Exactly, U.S. imperialism. So, can you just start with a very brief, sort of nutshell definition of how you see your politics, how you would describe them, the term you would use for them, and what they entail, what it entails?
Sure. So, yeah, I guess I would call myself a social democrat, which, I should say at the outset is, even compared to democratic socialists, like a less resonant term in the United States.
Right.
Like that if one would go to Western Europe or Canada, there would be a recognition, whether the left, the center, or the right, as sort of how to sort of categorize and pigeonhole a person politically by that nomenclature. So I'm actually almost, like, in that sense, and several others, I'm sympathetic to the democratic socialist nomenclature, which actually in the United States as you of course know, and many of our 4 or 5 viewers know, has a very resonant history, going through the Socialist Party in the early 20th century, led by Debs, and then into Norman Thomas.
We should note, by the way, that I didn't do this on purpose, but where I work every day, where I sit in my apartment, is right in front of a giant picture of Eugene Debs. He's the one who's behind me here.
Right, and I shouldn't, and I should even mention this on. Well, actually, I can't mention this on in a public forum, but I will tell you later, and I promise you will laugh a lot.
Wow.
Okay, and you'll know why I can't say it, but it has something to do with Debs.
Okay.
So then through Michael Harrington, who is sort of claimed by both social democrats, democratic socialists, and some liberals too, as part of his tradition. It's sort of a protean, ambiguous tradition in some senses, but a rich one. So basically what I'd say as a social democrat, or the other phrase I sometimes use, which I think is maybe even more confusing, is a leftist liberal or a liberal leftist, is that I think that, capitalism is a system, no surprises to anybody who's been alive or has read a few things or both, a system which creates chronic complications and contradictions and creates chronic issues of inequality of wealth, income, and power across a whole wide spectrum of social, cultural, economic, and political dimensions. And so that has to be, if you have our broad, rough view about what is just and fair and equitable and humane in the world, that has to be remedied aggressively. So my first views on that is that requires a large distribution of wealth, income, and power between the most powerful and the wealthiest people in the world, and their influence, again, across all those metrics. There's a cultural metric, a political metric, an economic metric, a social metric. And there also requires a decommodification of most public goods. Now, we can argue about what is a public good? Nellie, please. What is a public good? And what decommodification entails? Is the Dutch universal healthcare system sufficient decommodification, which regulates to within an inch of their lives, nominally private health insurance companies, but they're so functionally well regulated that barely exists and covers the whole population. In fact, the Dutch actually switched for their own technical reason from single payer to this system about 12, 14 years ago. So is that sufficient decommodification? The point is, I believe in form of decommodification that covers a lot of public goods. We could talk about transportation. We could talk about banks. Talk about schools. We'd have to have a discussion about what equals a public good. And I also believe, corresponding with that, in a robust, ubiquitous, militant labor movement across a whole host of industries and sectors. And one of the major purposes of that labor movement is to protect and empower working people, which one way or another is most of us, one way or another, whether we work with a hoe or with a computer, empower the working people to defend themselves against the rest of capital. So, meaning what's left of capital, which will be a lot after lots of redistribution via taxes, via the law, via regulation, and lots of decommodification. So why aren't you didn't ask this, and I'll stop now because I know we have limited time, but You might then wonder why I'm not a socialist. I could sort of answer that question, or I could just defer.
Well, let me
for a while.
Let me explain. I don't disagree with anything that you just said, really, which you've done my work for me of defining the outlines of most of what I believe. The only thing I would add to much of that is, the whole premise of democratic socialism, right, is that the democratic aspects of our political system that we say we believe in, atrophied as they are, need to be extended into the economic realm, because the economic realm is what governs much of our lives, if not the vast majority of our lives. So why is it that we say we believe in political democracy, yet we live in this sort of authoritarian economic realm where capital gets to make all the decisions that it wants without much check on its power by anyone, certainly about the things that are most important to people's daily lives. And the real difference, I guess, is that historically the difference, for example, is that social democrats have often seen their task as to put that check on capitalist power through the decommodification of key goods that you've mentioned, but that essentially the capitalists, capital, are still in the saddle of society, right? So that's the key difference, is figuring it not just from a democratic socialist point of view. It's not just providing that check, but putting the working class in holding the main levers of power in society, not just checking capital. Do you agree with that?
I agree that that's a pretty fair description of historically, where social democracy left off and a vision of socialism took over or spun from. So my view on that is that today, 2019, the class system, and this is not a very original point, the class system is more complicated than in Marx's time, or at least more complicated than he worked it through. And so eventually, so you're going to have sometimes cross-class alliances, which seem a little odd. You could have them between left-wing independent contractor lawyers who effectively, are militant socialists and will take an economic hit on behalf of their ideological beliefs, and working class people of various kinds, meaning who work for a wage. And the famous phrase goes that you're in the working class or not, if you just don't show up for your job for 3 days, somebody calls you to ask how you feel, or somebody doesn't call you at all, and when you do show up, you're fired. So professionals have various options like that, and people will be more solicitous to them, even though now they're experiencing various economic pressures too. So I guess what I'm saying is the part about democratic power in the system is very important, which is why I champion robust unions as much as I do, because I think unless we come up with something different, and history is unknowable, and
right.
Who knows, unions are the institutional vehicle for class power. But I think the class arrangements themselves, students who become coffee baristas, who then become professors of sociology, are, I should have said history, because I didn't mean to jab you with the sociology.
Okay,
somebody's going to say that was a cheap hit. People, it was not a cheap hit. And if you
it's really not. No,
really, it's really not. And if you thought it was, you're too deep in the weeds. Okay, really, have a drink, sit down. So I think like that complicated class system makes it harder for me. Maybe this is my failure to envision how like the class or those classes take full power. They must take more power. We have to restructure both the political culture and the political economy. But I can't quite get to where they take full power. I think if I was sitting in a cafe with you in Paris or Berlin in 1913, or maybe even 1934, maybe we'd be sitting in New York then, I would be with you. But I think at this moment in history, I can't get there. Maybe that's maybe my imagination is impoverished, but I can't quite get there.
Well, I don't want to talk too much about this because it is slightly in the weeds question, but the idea of what Eric Olin Wright, the Marxist sociologist who just died a few weeks ago, called the contradictory class locations. Right? I mean, this is this idea that people do not have some kind of cut and dry class interests, and you're like, oh yes, you have the correct interests, you now get to be in power. You have the wrong interests, you are like. That's a question that Marxists have long wrestled with and have answers to. Also we're not. I mean, it's not like we're democratic socialists, right? So we're not sort of like divvying up who goes to the guillotine or something. Which, although this is also a question that is long-standing between Marxists and social democrats.
And in fairness, I mean, Jacobin, you gotta like have a heart of stone not to love Jack. I mean, anyway, just because Basker is so witty and imaginative as your Lenin.
Bhaskar Sankara, the founder of Jacobin.
Right. And just to see it, I got my new issue the other day. It's just such a beautiful text, I mean, it's old school in that way. It's almost like, there's like it's like the high point of like, Lukácsian bourgeois realism, which he used to extol. Now we're back in the 19th century with this beautiful book in front of us, We're not virtual anymore. I mean, it's so witty, it's so smart, it's so engaged, it's so aggressive in marketing itself. Forgive the phrase, but he believes in a socialist marketplace, and he's brilliant at it. But it's also named Jacobin, which will raise the issue of the most militant, aggressive, and lethal phase, of the French Revolution. So I think that's interesting, actually. I mean, we'll put it to the side. And I'm not saying, oh, that's what you believe in. Because I think part of that is just commodified branding, and it's great branding. But I think that's always something socialists have to deal with.
Well, this also gets at one difference between social democrats and socialists of various stripes historically, which is that, like, we take that name. The name comes more from the black Jacobins of Haiti than the Jacobins of the French Revolution, but still it has this connotation. And from my perspective, I mean, being, there's a connotation of a Jacobin style of argument, right? Of not, I don't mean the magazine, I mean like the historical, Jacobin rage, like, and in the United States, where liberalism has been, the left has been so dominated by, especially over the last few decades, a kind of technocratic liberalism. For me, there's value in putting forward that kind of Jacobin critique, this sort of like fire-breathing, uncompromising. You're not trying to tinker around the edges of the existing system. You're rhetorically saying, not literally, but rhetorically, burn it all down. Like, bring that sort of that robust style of critique, and just saying like all of this is BS. Like this is a hellscape that we live in, and we should be very pissed off about that. And there should be that kind of rage in the critique that you make of the actually existing society. And that is not something that social democrats have always or have usually done historically, right? There's not that kind of, especially when they're in power. It's a sort of like the critique is that they're there to sort of manage capitalism rather than to totally reshape society. Right?
Certainly all the more so in the last generation or two, since I'd argue Mitterrand in 1981, who came in with like big promises to transform capitalism. French capital basically went on strike, and then Mitterrand capitulated. What I'll say about what you just said, which is interesting, is even the smartest conservatives, there are a few. Ross Douthat is one of them. Regularly reads Jacobin because he sees that there's a ethno-nationalist, racial nationalist, organic nationalist right wing, and a very different, Marxist, socialist left wing that are both criticizing the liberal consensus from their prospective places. So Jacobin has sort of done a really good job in setting that left boundary, or expanding it, we'll say, because let's assume that there are no boundaries except in our imaginations. So, and the smart people on the right see it's a pincer movement between like this kind of ethno-nationalist right that like Trump embodies, and a DSA/Jacobin AOC left that you guys are pushing forward.
So let's. There's a lot to say there. We'll get into some of this further in the conversation. But you mentioned your belief in the working class as an agent of change in society, the organized working class unions as an agent of change in society. Again, something we also agree on. But this, for what we should just mention. I mean, for one thing, this makes you different than some social democrats. I mean, I think of somebody like Tony Judt, the European historian, who wrote a ton, arguing for social democracy in America.
Yeah.
But if you read a book like Ill Fares the Land, which is one of his last books, I think, before he died,
that was
the working class doesn't really figure into his proposal for a changed society. You're not quite sure how this society is to come about. Who the change agent is who brings about this new society. And you mentioned your emphasis on the organized working class being that change agent, if for no other reason that we don't know who else can substitute for the organized working class, right? Which is something I agree with. And we should talk about this just because, especially at a time when Bernie Sanders, we're recording this on Wednesday. Bernie Sanders announced his candidacy for presidency yesterday, and we're going to be hearing a lot about this in the months and years to come about this focus on class. And can you just explain a bit more about that, what it means and maybe what it does not mean to focus on the working class? I mean, the Bernie, obviously the Bernie stereotype is this sort of like idealization of a white male industrial worker. And you say, well, if you want to put your focus on the working class, that means that you want to be focusing on this white male industrial worker. I've always found this bizarre, especially in the last couple of years, when at the forefront of the working class movements in the United States, right now, of course, it's the teachers union movement,
right.
A movement that we've covered very, very closely at Jacobin, and the groups like the Democratic Socialists of America are very excited about the development of. And these are, of course, this is a movement that's largely led by female teachers, often female teachers of color. In Chicago, the book that I wrote about the Chicago Teachers Union, that's certainly the case, certainly in a lot of urban areas, but even in places like West Virginia, largely led by women teachers. So I've always wondered who exactly this argument against, who exactly is being argued against when people say the working class means the white industrial male worker. It doesn't seem like any socialists I know are making that argument.
Right. So a couple of things. This kind of theory of social democracy without like strong unions or whatever sort of substitute or augmentation of unions we can imagine in the future, is a weird thing. And it's interesting. Judd, rest in peace. Guy died of ALS and kept writing through the end, sort of tied to respirators and stuff. It's just sort of a remarkable kind of intellectual and physical courage at the end. But yeah, he went from being a Marxist writing for History Workshop, which was the British journal, which was the British Marxist historical journal of the 1970s, to, certainly not a right-winger, not even a liberal, but, a kind of a social democrat who didn't believe in an agency that would generate social democracy. You have the same thing in one of, my, favorite books of recent years by Lane Kenworthy, Social Democratic America, which I reviewed in Dissent a few years ago, where if I look at Kenworthy's sort of program, close your eyes, just wave a magic wand, we can get here. It's bigger than Bernie's program. It's like a 10% increase in social transfers, of 10% of GDP. So that's 1.7 trillion per year, right? And it's great. It's got all kinds of stuff. Then in the middle of the book, he just says, the unions, and he runs through the stats, declining union membership, not just in the United States, but, all over the advanced world. That's not coming back. We ought to give them a gold watch, and that's not going to happen. And as I said, and it's very brusque and brisk. It's not angry. He can't even generate enough energy to be angry. It's just kind of moving along. And as I said in my review, okay, but tell me how this happens. Tell me how this happens without some broad movement from below, which I associate with unions. And I can see that intercutting with racial justice movements and gender equality movements too. But, how do you get there? And so to me, that is fundamental. And I'm glad, as you were talking, you added the phrase organized working class. Because I don't think it's almost by definition that the disaggregated working class can have that kind of political power, because how can they bring it to bear unless they have some sort of structure? I'm very much a Hobsbawmian here. Eric Hobsbawm, the great British Marxist historian, we had this kind of famous tussle at the time, at least among leftists, with Piven and Cloward about their book Poor People's Movements. And this was a New York Review of Books essay from 1979 or something. You can find in one of his books, I think, Workers, and where Hobsbawm says, this is a lot about spontaneous upsurges of poor people and working people, and yes, that happens. I've studied it in my book, Primitive Rebels, and all that. But in order to really get stuff, make things better, you need organizations that can last. That's always stayed with me. So I don't see a way to get from here to Lane Kenworthy's sort of, I think, excellent vision and excellent sort of, left technocratic public policy ideas, or Matt Brunig's left technocratic public policy ideas. He has a lot of great ideas too. Or Tony Judd's vision in the last decade, 15 years of his career. I don't see how to get there without masses of people coming together in pretty coherent organizations and being aggressive enough to sort of say, we want this stuff and we are going to fight hard to get it. And therefore, by doing that, they escalate the crisis level for those who mostly control the economy and the political system. So, to me, there is no social democracy. There is no sort of half-assed welfare, but still, thank God for him, FDR welfare system without a mobilized working class. as we saw in the 1930s. There's like pretty much nothing, there isn't, you can't pass a law on, child labor, without, you can't pass any, in other words, what I'm saying, you can't pass any discrete law, let alone change an entire mode of political economy and political culture without mobilized opposition from below, I believe. Because I think even if the best meaning technocrats sit in the room and work it out, they will sort of self-censor themselves, or cut some kind of deal, well-meaning, with their adversaries. Things might get marginally better, but only if there's a surge from below do things get significantly better, and both politics and economics, meaning power, changes. So if there is a social democracy out there which doesn't believe in a mobilized working class, and I'll just say whatever, augmented by sympathetic professionals or whoever, academics, whoever, some intellectual infrastructure, I don't see how that works, and I suspect that's part of the reason, it's a long question, why social democracy is in such crisis in Western Europe.
So I agree with that. The only question is, so then why is that view and that concern for keeping that working class organized and active and militant and disruptive and all that stuff, why has that not been at the heart of the social democratic program in the 20th and early 21st century? It's for the most part, that's not been something that has been at the heart of that philosophy, that political philosophy, right? It's been something that's been sort of shunted to the side.
Well, in Europe, I think, let me back up. In the U.S., it's hard to say there has been a social democratic movement in the 21st century. There's been something, there's been a liberal movement.
There's like social democratic programs, but not an actual social democratic movement, right?
Yeah, social democratic programs, but not social democratic movement. Like, say, a guy like Paul Krugman, who actually, will, and he will actually say he supports strong unions when he writes, and he's just, he's a very influential guy, but he's just, one egghead sitting with his computer, and he'll say, oh yeah, here's a bunch of good programs, and all of us, who share our broad politics would say, yeah, those programs are great, but he's not attached to any movement. He's just sort of an autonomous intellectual making his points. There's no movement. What there is, and maybe this answers your question, is like sort of a center, if this is to the right of social democracy, but, a center liberalism, which is very dependent on a centrist technocracy. Now, I'm all for, I'm a big fan of technocrats, leftists, all kinds, because they can argue with each other. But we need to figure out how stuff runs, too. I mean, when Che Guevara, was made the minister of economics in Cuba, that was a bad fit. Like, this guy didn't know shit about economics. Like, he knew, he was a doctor, and he knew how to, fight a revolution. But he was bad at that. He didn't know how to manage sugar production. It's good. Knowing things is good. Expertise is good. But what happens with that sort of technocratic centrist Obama liberalism? And I'm not going to say that they didn't make significant incremental changes too. Is that I believe that they don't believe in collective agency. And I'm stealing this line from somebody who's much more prominent than you and I, but I can't mention that person's name because I don't have permission to. But this person, one day over lunch, made this point to me, and it really stuck with me. I think we were talking about what's his name, Arne Duncan, the Secretary of Education back in the Obama years, right? I think somehow he came out and he said the thing with Duncan and guys like that is they believe in a meritocracy. They want to help. They sincerely want to help by their lights. Say poor kids get a leg up. They don't want them to be immiserated for their lives, but they don't believe in that happening via collective agency. So they don't believe in unions. Collective agency to them is threatening. Individual meritocratic agency is accepted. And to me, that's the failure, let's just say now, of liberalism without unions. Leaving aside if we can get the social democracy with unions, which I think we kind of can. We're kind of almost blending that now, as we see in the, Democratic Party's left quadrant. But liberalism without unions doesn't even have the same mechanism FDR had, which was a kind of labor liberalism. So that to me is really significant. Now, part of the reason for that, and it's kind of an obvious point, is unions have a lot less members now. So they can't use as much leverage as they used to. So it's easy for politicians who aren't true believers to blow them off.
Well, so before you move on to that, so just let me ask you, you mentioned FDR, for example. So is your contention that sort of the best, what happened in the New Deal, right, was that there was an extremely militant, there was a rising militancy within the working class, which created a crisis for FDR and for the Democratic Party, and that played a major role in producing the social democratic gains that came out of the New Deal, right? So what's your thinking about this? Is your thinking like we need to build these this organized and militant working class so that we can wring those gains out of a figure like FDR, and that's the sort of best we can hope for, is to, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way, I just mean is that the sort of horizon, just like the creation of more of these social democratic programs, decommodify more things like healthcare and education and whatever else, and the extent to which you get that stuff comes through an organized working class, or is there anything that goes beyond that?
Again, history is unknowable. There can always be things that go beyond that. And that, whatever that was, is 75, 80 years ago now. So, and also, first things first, on the ground, the first thing to do, if it's at all possible, is increase the weight, the number, the significance of that organized working class. Now, in the American presidential system, where there's separation of powers, and you have to elect Congress separate from the president, it's a totally the sugar system. We'd be better off, like pretty much every other country, with a parliamentary system. But with that system, it's hard to generate leverage. And if you can, you can imagine, as the new issue of Jacobin does, like Bernie as or Warren or somebody, or even an opportunist, because FDR was kind of an opportunist. He didn't really care about the Wagner. He didn't even come out in favor of it. Wagner pushed it hard, and then FDR signed it, and he said, "Oh, geez, this is pretty smart. I can win re-election myself." So you can imagine anybody, Kamala Harris, if she's pressured enough, responding to a mobilized mass movement with significant policy changes. If, in fact, they also make significant procedural changes, because the procedure is so screwed up. Like, you got to get rid of the filibuster. You need a simple majority in the Senate. 60 is going to make everything harder. Now, is that the end? No, because I don't think history works that way. I think, class is dynamic. Political culture is dynamic. It doesn't end in that way. So after that happened in the United States in the 1930s into the 1940s, there were changes. Those changes went the other way. Those changes were not to enhance or augment redistribution of wealth and power, and enhance and augment the pressure that a working class movement put on the political and economic elite, but to kind of like settle for it like it's a good deal, which is, understandable, because, a lot of people, it's like the old Oscar Wilde line, which he never actually said, it's apocryphal, but, the problem with socialism is there's too many evenings. Some people say too many meetings, other people say, and it's kind of like, yeah, part of like a mass social justice movement is done for the people who want to sit in their lazy boys, watch the NFL. Because not everybody's a movement builder. Not everybody's got interest in politics. So you had a dynamic then, but that dynamic went the other way. It rose and then it settled out. Now time goes on. Now we have something else. Certainly not at the scale of say 1934, 1937, but something else emerging now that's significant enough to take serious note of. And we don't know where that's going to go. So, in answer to your question, it could be much more than what the, Roosevelt revolution, as some people call it.
I would say that's my hope as a democratic socialist. I personally, and Jacobin as a magazine has never been one to, just wave off reforms like the ones that came from the New Deal or the Great Society or any social democratic programs you want to list off. Life in the U.S. can often be pretty miserable, and if you go elsewhere, you find out that it does not have to be that miserable with some very basic social democratic changes, and we would never dismiss those kind of gains. And in fact, we think those gains can become the basis for demanding more if gone about the right way. But I guess that last point gets to it, that there is there is a sort of utopian horizon that we see that is one that involves sort of conquering the capitalist imperative of accumulating more and more and more profit, because that imperative is what makes it so that we can't have nice things in society. That's the imperative that makes it so that when we win the kind of social democratic gains that you're talking about, immediately capital gets to work trying to dismantle those gains, right?
Yeah.
So there's the vision for us to get to, so we'll be able to have these gains and not have to worry about them immediately being swept away by capital, who wants to get rid of Medicare or get rid of the free college or whatever it is, so that they can make money in healthcare or higher education. But on those topics, we should get to Bernie, which we've been talking about a little bit so far.
I just one quick point about what you just said, because I think it's important. Precisely because the social democratic movements, which turned into parties and governments, were successful for so many years, their baseline is so much higher than that of the United States. In other words, now we read about turns to the right in Denmark or Sweden, or the long-standing turn to the right in Germany, which was not like the Scandinavian countries. And now there's a turn back to the left among the German social democrats, which is much to be happy about. But precisely because their baseline is so much higher, they're spending so much more percentage of their GDP on government funding. The level of their social democracy is so much more sophisticated and large versus the partial social democracy, if that, in the United States, that our trend line gives us a lot. In other words, they could go to the right and we could go to the left and we'd still be spending a couple of $1 trillion a year less on various things that they've already won. In other words, they could lose some things because, as you say, capital reconsolidates itself, keeps pushing. And we could push against capital, and there'd still be that huge space. So we have this enormous space here to operate. And the bad news is that we have it because our system is so primitive. The good news is we're an incredibly wealthy country, and we have it. So we can push upward toward that.
Which is of course what is at the heart of the Bernie Sanders campaign. You often mention Elizabeth Warren in the same breath, which I guess I would too. Although we can talk about why our differing visions of Elizabeth Warren. But in generally, of course, that's what these campaigns are all about, right? Is the operating in that massive space, that vacuum where social democratic programs would be in, say, European countries. Although, I mean, Bernie, actually, one thing we should talk about before that is just a question of the Democratic Party, because I think this is one place where we do have some significant differences. The Democratic Party. You write about the party a lot. We publish stuff about them a lot. The party, you're mentioning social democracy in these other countries, right? In Europe and Canada, et cetera. And in all of those countries, there are workers' parties, social democratic parties, labor parties of some sort that have been the historical champions of that agenda. Many of them have gone to the right and embraced free market solutions or whatever. But historically, there was a party that was sort of dedicated to being that workers' party to fighting for those kind of social democratic gains. And of course, this is one of the principal things that's missing in American society. So, from my point of view, this is something that the left has long struggled with, right? What to do about this fact, because we're left with these Democrats who are, the working class is sort of put into seen as the essential part of the base of the Democratic Party, but of course it is not a working class party. It is not a labor party. And so some leftists historically have said, many leftists have said, well, then given that, then we don't want anything to do with the Democratic Party. This is a fundamentally bourgeois party, so we just don't want anything to do with it. We need to start a third party. We need to start a workers' party in the United States, which, as we know, has not really. The full history is more complicated than they've done nothing, but clearly, in terms of winning, a toehold in the electoral system. I mean, even if you look at a place like Canada, right? Like the NDP, the New Democratic Party, is their social democratic party, and they've never held office at the federal level, but they have all kinds of state level power, or province level power throughout the society, and they play this important role in sort of putting social democratic policies on the agenda for the country. We don't have that here. So the question is, what do you do about that? And the line, one of our most read articles of recent years is an article which I'm sure you've read, The Blueprint for a New Party by Seth Ackerman and Jacobin, which basically argues that
I have.
The structural barriers at this point to creating a new party, like a new party on a new ballot line, are just insurmountable. They're not going to be. We're not going to be in a place where we can do that anytime soon. So let's abandon that project for the moment. But we also can't forget that the Democratic Party, can never be a party that can fight for all this stuff for us. And so his proposed solution is the creation of a party-like formation that focuses not on having a ballot line, but having some kind of internal coherency that can keep its candidates accountable. So, for example, just to use the Democratic Socialists of America, because it's easy to see how the strategy could be used for the Democratic Socialists of America. When you go to the voting booth, it doesn't say, so-and-so Democratic Socialists Party, but that person is endorsed by the party. There are disciplinary mechanisms to ensure that candidate does not, abandon whatever the DSA's policy program, et cetera. And so it's a way of sort of creating an organization within a party that can still use the Democratic Party's ballot line, but that has a kind of combative relationship with the party. And for us, I mean, in general, that's our orientation, is sort of like doing battle with this party that we feel has over and over again abandoned the interests of the working class. So when you read about the Democratic Party in Jacobin, it's usually very hostile. Can you believe that these Democrats have sold us out yet again? And so this is slightly different from how you approach the party, I think.
Oh yeah, no, it is. I mean, I'd say, yeah, it's significantly different in a structural and I guess historical way. And it seems to me, and of course I could be wrong, but it seems to me it's creating a lot of extra work. Mm-hmm. And for a project that's already going to be an enormous amount of work, like any big things you try to do to change the economy.
And when you say the project, what do you mean by the project? Transformation of the party to the more leftward direction?
Well, transformation of the country in a leftward direction. Okay, so that could be farther left, or it could just be to my left, or it could just be to anybody's left. But my thinking on this is right. So I read Seth's article. He's a really great historian, very sharp thinker. I guess I think the part where I gets lost, he understands the structural problems with just sort of creating a new party. But then when he says, and you say, and others who agree with you, the Democratic Party can never, ever be. To me, that's like really metaphysical. Like, and I just think of it like in terms of like there are historical possibilities, and so I take that Harrington view, Michael Harrington view, from which he articulated in the 60s and the 70s. He talked about it a lot in his book Socialism. That basically, for various historical reasons, what labor got in the United States was a cross-pressured Democratic Party. Meaning, labor got its piece of it, beginning in the New Deal. But then it still had like Southern white supremacists as a huge bloc. Then over time, it African Americans joined. But there's always been this cross pressure. At a certain point, it was happening over time. But then there was a big break in the 60s, and the white supremacists joined the Republicans, which was his goal or his desire to sort of clean up the lines. But there's still significant business influences in the Democratic Party to this day, as there were in the 30s and the 40s as well, for that matter, which we think of as the high point of the New Deal. Even then, like labor couldn't overturn, or rather, labor pressuring Congress couldn't sustain Truman's veto of Taft-Hartley because it only had influence, significant influence in a certain amount of states and didn't have national influence. So, but my view is the analog for what you do in the Democratic Party, we can see in what happened in the Republican Party, where the Goldwaterites and the Southwestern and Southern Californian conservatives, grounded in petty bourgeois or small business people, as, by the way, is the Tea Party and much of Trump's movement today. Real estate agents, independent contractors, the local sporting goods store, not the big chain. Car dealerships. Like they said, wait a minute, this party is a party of like Wall Street big banks. It's a party of Rockefeller, Tom Dewey, these New Yorkers, these Eastern elites. These want to sort of like, just maintain control of the money supply and screw us. Fuck this. Let's bring it down to the local level. We can beat these guys. And, of course, we know that over time they did. Like they just said, here's the brand. We've got this brand. It's called the Republican Party. But we're going to change what that brand means. And now it's going to be like a libertarian party. And then when the white supremacists join, it just becomes a party of cultural, racial, and gendered reaction, too, as it turns out. So to me, that's focus on the Harrington solution or proposal, go through the Democratic Party, do what AOC does. Iglesias, there's an interview, and Matt Iglesias is part of it, or a roundtable. There's a horse race discussion, the current Jacobin, the one coming out now. It was cool of you to bring in Iglesias to sort of test your own priors, because he's kind of almost like reptilian in an intellectually cold-blooded way to just kind of like not make it personal, but just kind of attack priors of other people and his own. And
I appreciate the repeated commercials for the new issue of Jacobin.
It's a really good issue. And I disagree with Jacobin a lot, any given article, but the project is cool. And this is a very interesting symposium. And I'm pretty sure Matt stole what I've been saying on Twitter, to my 11,000 followers versus his 500,000, whatever it is, that one of the things that I think is really strategically smart about AOC, like leave aside her policies and all the other nonsense attending to her, but strategically smart is that she always refers to the Democratic Party as our party. Right. In other words, I'm taking ownership here. This is as much my party as Nancy Pelosi's or Chuck Schumer's or Barack Obama's or Hillary Clinton's or anybody in between or the DNC. My party, it's the party of the people who support me too, and some of my colleagues in the Congress who share my politics. And we're a faction in it, and we're going to keep fighting until we're a controlling faction. And it seems to me that's the way to do this. That there's no either metaphysical impediment, historical impediment, or structural impediment to just if you have enough money, which now you can get through the internet, to beat back the big money, and you have enough voters, supporters, you can do just what the right-wing Republicans did in the Republican Party. You can just win offices, win nominations, take things over.
Right. I mean, I'm a big fan of AOC for the most part, what she's done so far. But I am a little skeptical of her ability. I mean, certainly the party internally is mobilizing against her to.
Absolutely.
I mean, even before she even took office, they're sort of like starting to sharpen the knives.
Right. That's true.
And when that business interest is still at the heart. When there are still, pieces of capital that are at the heart of that party's coalition, there are always going to be, unless those. I mean, that just seems to be baked into the party to me. Is that these interests of capital are there? You disagree?
Oh, I certainly agree that that's a segment of the party. As I said, as the political scientists say, it's cross pressure, and of course, the weaker the labor movement is, and the fewer members the labor movement. That makes that even more salient. Obviously, Truman had to pay a lot more attention to, labor 1947 and 48 than, say, Obama had to pay attention to it, or Clinton, or Bill Clinton, in the 1990s or more recently, 2008 to 2016. But to me, that's not written in stone. And of course, there's the opposition. I mean, like we agree, this is all about huge stakes. There's power involved. There's money involved. There's like a worldview of what the society should look like involved. But to me, that's no different than if you were going to say to some workers, I don't see how we even organize a union here because, these guys are so strong. They can just replace us. If we they can just fire us all and bring in new people any day. I mean, right. It's going to be a struggle, just the way it was, by the way, for the Goldwaterites. It's going to be a real struggle. But to me is the struggle to have. Okay. That's the fight.
Let's say you're right about this. But the Goldwaterites or the Tea Party took this extremely combative role with the party. They were not like, this is, we're just happy to be here doing our thing in our party. They primaried Republicans. They declared war on the segment of the party that was not their own. And so, from my perspective, it's sort of like the New Deal example of you have if you want any kind of social democratic gains whatsoever, you need to organize a mass militant organized working class that can fight like hell to fight for communism, as many of them were at the time in the 30s and 40s, and maybe you'll get some social democracies. The same thing could be said about the Democratic Party. Well, why wouldn't you just sort of declare war on the right wing, or the centrist, the neoliberal segments of the party, and if you can do good organizing, then you'll ostensibly be able to force out the people, the I don't know, the Cory Bookers, the Chuck Schumers, the centrist neoliberal wing of the party. But taking that fundamentally combative angle against them seems to be useful, even if we're doing the Rich Yeselson program for trying to transform the party.
Well, I mean, here's where I think the difference is not so much in program or policy or the ideology that comes before program and policy that shapes it. Maybe just more in terms of the affect and art of this. and sort of sitting in a room and figuring out, well, who are the targets? Like Cory Booker's a great one, because in fact, hey, thank God for opportunists, because that means that your political pressure has worked. I mean, Cory Booker has now moved to the left,
right?
Because he feels the heat. Nancy Pelosi, who back in the day was herself the Democratic left, San Francisco Democrat and all that, responded to the pressure from AOC and others about the Green New Deal. Now, she's not crazy about it. Nope, she is not. But she moved. So in all of those situations, like, the question becomes, and this is really just strategic leverage stuff, like the stuff I used to do when I worked in labor. Not I think, first principles, not, I think, ideological, academic almost analysis. So strategic stuff, we're sitting in a room and we're looking at, say, a big whiteboard of doing a power structure analysis of the Democratic parties. Who are the people that you give vinegar to, and who are the people you give honey to? Like, who are the people you just say, we want you out, and we're gonna like primary you, like you're an objective enemy of humane progress. I mean, and there's no room in our vision of the Democratic Party for somebody like you, whoever you happen to be. Maybe a donor.
The people.
Right. Yeah. Which may be a donor. It doesn't even have to be an active pol. It may be party officials at the DNC. It may be pollsters. And then there are the people where you think, okay, these people are very frightened as it is. And they're smart. They're attuned to which way the wind is blowing. And so actually maybe you can sort of, give them some positive reinforcement when they move to the left and sort of say, that's good, thank you. And keep pushing them, keep leveraging them as they move to the left. And you'll see, not so much the Tea Party, but over time, the Goldwaterites did this. Stop me if I told you this story. Well, I guess I haven't told our audience this story. But, after, in 1976, Reagan makes his challenge to Jerry Ford for the Republican nomination. He barely misses, takes it to the convention. He loses by 100 delegates or something, 50 delegates. And the right wing is very much like the Bernie people in 2016, but even more so because it was so close, right? And really, and the Ford people and the party establishment were, saying, we got to do anything we can to stop these people, and they do. They managed barely to do it, but they do. So after that, with my old age aphasia, I'm forgetting both their name, but these very famous, I think one of them was Howard Phillips, two very famous conservative activists are enraged. Screw these guys, we're done with the Republican Party. See, we did it. We tried to take it over. We tried to push hard. Then they screw Ronald Reagan, who's the embodiment of the principal conservatism we want. They screw him out of the nomination. Start the third party. They go to Jesse Helms, right? Famous racist, reactionary, and all kinds of other terrible things. But, major party figure. They say, we've had it with these guys. So we want to form a third party, and we hope that you'll consider being its nominee for president in 1980. Start building right now. We can do it, and we think we can win. And Helms said, "You guys are crazy. Did you see how close we got? You guys are nuts. That's just going to make a Democrat president. That's just going to make the liberals have more power in this country." He said, "Here's what you do. You get back to work on the Reagan train, and you just keep pushing Reagan. And in 1980, Reagan's not only going to be nominated, like Goldwater was, like he almost was this last time. He's going to be elected president, and we're going to start to change things in this country." It's like, third party? Come on, get real. That's what they did, and of course, the rest is history. And that's kind of the way I view it. And then right. The questions you raise about, which one, the primer. I mean, AOC was brilliant in who she targeted because he wasn't the worst of the lot, but he was a go along, get along type. And in fact, I just saw yesterday that what's the guy's name? Sorry, I'm losing it on names. So the guy that AOC beat.
Crowley.
Thank you. Joe Crowley, just joined some bipartisan, firm in Washington to do lobbying. It's a perfect ending for him. That's the perfect. That's what they do. This is. He lands upward. He's in a safe space. Right? He doesn't strangle his cats and and beat his kids, but he's the kind of guy. Great guy to primer. But you go through it person by person and see where you have the leverage and where you can do it.
But isn't the Reagan story, the lesson is don't break and form this third party. But again, that's not what leftists like me are arguing for. Right. I don't know, President Bernie Sanders to do, or presidential candidate Bernie Sanders to do. We're arguing more for the Jesse Helms strategy. I hope no one captures this clip and
cuts it.
Jacobin is arguing for the Jesse Helms strategy.
Jacobin endorses Jesse Helms.
Yeah, exactly. We're arguing more for that's sort of strategy. We're not arguing for that immediate break just because the structural pressures are too broad.
Not true, fair. But the other thing those guys continue to do is they continue to create a different reality within the party. And that to me goes back to Harrington. Right. The vehicle is there. And the other thing about both American politics, American parties, you don't even have to be a quote unquote member of the Democratic or Republican Party. There's no membership party cards like there is in European Party. I mean, the barriers to entry are incredibly low. There's no structural barriers. There's a lot of other structural problems like ballot access and things for third parties. But the ballot to just sort of say, "Oh, I'm a Democrat." I mean, anybody could say that I'm a Democrat and I'm running as a Democrat. And I guess what I'm saying is, it's a brand name with it's sort of a Potemkin village. It's a brand name. It's got money flowing in and out of it. But whoever's got the most leverage and the most persuasiveness can win. And I do think this is a huge country, and there's going to have to be tremendous changes for either my idea of the left or your idea of the left to sort of win nationwide. And that, nationally, the party isn't, Queens and Brooklyn or some of the other districts where Social Democrats or Democratic Socialists or DSA types won. But that's the goal. And if that is your goal, I don't see, for example, how Seth Ackerman's really, well worked out and really smart theory of the case makes it any more likely to sort of get actual rank and file support on the ground. If you can't take over the Democratic Party, how is this sort of not a third party per se, but this apparatus, this attachment to the Democratic Party going to succeed any better? It's there. Just go do it. AOC, our party. I get how Bernie, it's not his brand. His brand is to be independent, and that actually resonates a lot, especially with young people who are generally anti-institutional. But he, as again Iglesias said in this in this symposium in the forthcoming issue, the current issue of Jacobin, that actually pisses off a lot of Democrats too. So if you want to win, you're going to there will be people to the right who form the coalition, not to the right as in Republican right, but to the right of, say, a Sanders-type candidate or even a Warren-type candidacy. And I agree, they're not the same. For one thing, she bluntly says she's not socialist. She's a reformist capitalist. They're not the same.
Well, we should wrap up here because we're around the hour mark. But we just real quick, we should go into this discussion of Bernie, and which you were winding up to do. I mean, from perspective, Bernie Sanders changed my thinking on what was possible in American politics, last time around. Obviously changed a lot of people's perceptions of that. I had sort of, made my peace with being a socialist magazine editor whose ideas were perhaps capital C correct, but would never have any
real world impact.
Exactly, they wouldn't actually catch on among the American people who for historical reasons are just immune to socialism and immune to those kind of social democratic ideas. And of course, Bernie Sanders comes along and shows all of us that is actually not the case. And so there's the obvious stuff that people already know about what's unique about him, blah blah blah. But for me, an added piece of his campaign, what's so special about it, and which I think has been borne out in the last couple of years in terms of the organized working class, or the disorganized but militant working class in the United States, is that there is a rising sense of working class militancy that I don't think you can tie. It doesn't it's not one-to-one like Bernie runs, therefore West Virginia teachers go on strike. But there is this injection of class politics into American society doesn't just play out in like increased support for Medicare for all or college for all. It also plays out in larger numbers of teachers deciding to go on strike, and just in general the working class getting more restive and being willing to take on more militancy. I mean, as we already said, the teachers' strike wave is the best example of that, because it's just taken off like wildfire. So that, for me, that is what's one of the things that's most central to his campaign, is that ability, the potential ability, and that demonstrated ability in the past to act as a kind of accelerant of working class struggle, as well as like all the things we talk about, sort of heightening the contradictions within the Democratic Party. I mean,
I agree with this.
The centrist neoliberal types are obviously livid that he is decided. I love when people argue, Bernie Sanders, he's not even a real Democrat, and I feel like, yes, you're correct. He's not a real Democrat. That's why people like him, because he's not
right. No, it's not
real
Democrat. Clearly, some people do. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, all of this is just to say that that his campaign, to me, offers a chance to do all kinds of stuff besides putting the kind of social democratic demands on the table, obviously on a national level, which he's already done, but also helping cohere this currently unorganized and miserable American working class, helping it come back together and act with the kind of organized power that you were talking earlier about in the New Deal era, to win changes to not make life so hellish in the United States.
I completely agree with that. I mean, when historians look, that's such a cliche. Who knows what they'll say? We'll be dead. But just looking at it from right now, where we're sitting and the time of day it is, over the last several years, there has been a dynamic that has promoted different kinds of militancy, including, it's the development of it is uneven sectorally, but you see what I've called like sort of laborism among both the teachers, grad students, across the new media, across like the internet new media companies, like there's, Vox, Slate.
Every week there's like a new union announcement.
Yeah, right, exactly. Now, the trick here is, this is unlike the Fordist economy. These aren't the commanding heights, right? So this isn't like steel and auto in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? Where you had they really represented like the nexus of the political economy, and you went through them, and then you got to all these small business people and all these wholesalers. And
the American economy doesn't grind to a halt if the Slate, editorial assistant who writes the tweets stops writing tweets.
Right. Or like Brown's graduate students.
Right.
So, but it's active, it's militant. These people punch above their weight because they are the chroniclers. They're they're symbol analysts. They're not just products of capital. They reproduce the system and by reproducing it, they can change the system, transform it, because they're the ones who use words and numbers for a living. So they're telling their own story. So we are hearing about it.
And which can then infuse this kind of class consciousness.
Exactly. I mean, again, you can't do it straight line. It's not a scientific formula. And I think Bernie Sanders had a lot to do with that in a way we cannot measure. My thing with Bernie Sanders is, somebody offline was sort of saying it's kind of like, sort of classist itself to refer to people you don't know by their first name because it sounds like you're an insider. So I'm going to try to say Sanders sometimes, but I know it's like Bernie, how we familiar with him. I'm trying.
Oh, it's on the sign. It says Bernie on the sign.
No, it's true. That's true. That's his brand. But anyway, I think, like a few years ago, maybe 20, 30 years ago, Jesse Jackson had a great line about himself. He said, I'm a tree. He said, I'm a tree shaker, not a jelly maker. In other words, I'm an activist. I'm not the guy you put in charge after we've won. I'm going to keep pushing. But I'm not the administrative guy or the guy who sort of consolidates the gains and so. And I kind of feel a lot of that with Bernie. Like he has had a huge role here, and I do think, going back to the cliche, that historians will credit that, and that we credit that today, and that if he had not run, history today, the history of the Democratic Party would look very different. There wouldn't be an AOC, for example. There wouldn't be a DSA with like 10 times the membership it had before he ran. There would be a Jacobin, I believe, but it wouldn't be as energized and popular and as much of a thing as it is. There would be a dissent. I finally mentioned my own journal for a second. But it, too, is more energized and robust and has a lot of really super smart sort of people on this social democratic, socialist, left labor continuum working for it. I don't necessarily – I kind of think he's almost like Moses. I'm not sure if he can go beyond this. I mean, first of all, I really do think –
He can't enter the promised land?
Yeah, he's a really old dude. And it's a little – and, of course, this goes for – should be left unsaid, but I'll say this goes for Biden, too. I mean, there's a point – like it's a hard job. It's hard to think of somebody in their 80s doing it. And shit happens to people in their 80s, as anybody who's had elderly parents knows. Well, okay, but that's one issue. I mean, yeah. I know that's off politics, but that is one. I have several others, but yeah.
But I wanted to talk about just again before we wrap up here, because we should wrap up. What you said was like he's the tree shaker, not the jam maker. Isn't that sort of at the heart? I mean to me, that's actually a key. That argument is a key difference between a sort of democratic socialist and a social democrat. I mean, like, even you're like a class. You think that the working class needs to be militant and do all this stuff, and you think Bernie Sanders plays an important role. But like, you don't want to see Bernie like holding the levers of power. Maybe you don't think either you don't want to see it or you don't think he's up to the task. But like, from my perspective, I'm like, again, everything is so hellish without up to this point. Like, I think Bernie Sanders, whatever, maybe he would have trouble for a few weeks, like staffing the White House and whatever all the different agencies he has to find staff for. But I don't care. Like, I want to see like the levers of power like overtaken by a democratic socialist who can totally shape the world.
Right, and I'm sympathetic to that view, and I realize actually that my own rebuttal to it sounds so weak in that, make the guy, even 10 years younger. 20 would be better, but just make him 10 years younger. Make him, a little less kind of give him a couple of different registers besides just being the old Jewish guy in the Zabar's line yelling about how the corned beef isn't lean enough. Can you give me a better slice of corned beef? Like just give him just a few, like, being a politician, like it's a difficult job. I mean, he's pretty good at it, but it's a skilled job and have few different ways to talk, than rather that one register. So that sounds weak. Oh, yeah, not him. It's like people say, well, I'd vote for a woman, but then they start taking off all the women they wouldn't vote for, and that's something that liberals say. But give him another register. Give him a little more experience and sort of instinctive connection with the post-60s racial and gender changes. Like, he says the right things now, but he just doesn't have a good feel for racial justice and gender equality. And I feel better about it and here's one reason. And this is maybe also like, sort of like, something bad could happen. So that's what, ultimately this is the limits of people's militancy or mine. But I'll say, when he gets elected, assume he's elected, actually, it's probably the same thing for Warren, roughly. But we know, because we study struggle and fights on both class lines, we know that capital will want to destroy those guys. I mean, they just hate Democrats. They think all Democrats are socialists. So what if one guy comes in calling himself a socialist and the other one's just not a socialist, as she insists, but it's talking about breaking up banks and stuff. So there will be both from the media, the centrist media, and from capital, all kind of oil extraction, Wall Street, real estate, all of it, an effort to sort of prove socialism doesn't work. So I think the person who gets that job as like the first self-named socialist running for president has to, not just be aware that there's going to be a fight, but be a really, really shrewd strategic player. And I'm not sure if he is. He opposes.
What is the mechanism to overcome what you're talking about? Because from my
you can't. It'll just be a fight. But I don't think you can overcome it. There's just smarter or less smart ways to fight. Like knowing when to attack, knowing when to turn something with a joke or a deferral, knowing when to push a particular issue, knowing when to draw back on another issue. Because it's not going to be like the storming of the Winter Palace. There's going to be these modulations, these incredibly difficult things, which frankly, historically, were not used to happening in democratic advanced nations. We don't have many good pieces of history here. We have Allende that didn't work out too well. We have on a different level Mitterrand that didn't work out too well. We had the somewhat successful Attlee and Bevin in the UK after World War II, which at least brought them the NHS and some other changes. Here's an example. Let me give you something concrete rather than just talking about his skill level or whatever in the abstract. And this just happened like a day or so ago. And I tweeted about this actually this morning, so I'm sure you'll see big changes soon. But Bernie said, somebody asked him about the filibuster in the Senate. He said, he didn't say absolutely rule out advocating its change, but he said, I'm not really crazy about changing the filibuster. And again, your issue of Jacobin has a whole cool little article about small d democratic changes we need. And one of the first ones is abolish the filibuster.
Bernie just hasn't read it yet.
That's what I said. I said, Jacobin, talk to this guy. That's what I said. Seriously, that's what I said. Talk to him. Oh. So I mean, that's but seriously, that's a power relationship thing. That's a strategic leverage thing. That's kind of it's not ideological. It's not steeped in the literature. It's just what's our angle here? How do we leverage power? And whoever gets that job is going to think, shit, we're not getting anything done. We may not get anything done even with 50, given the way, fair point, the cross-pressured Democrats are. We may lose 5 Democrats or 8 Democrats, but we're sure not getting anything done if we need 60 votes, if we need a supermajority. That just gotta go, So I think stuff like that makes me think, he was almost ironically, because he's independent, but he was kind of in a one-party state or close to it in Vermont. He needs that. He was thinking more like a senator than a prospective president, because all the senators like that, They can act like egomaniacs and have power.
Well, I agree with you on that specific issue, but in general, the man talks about the need. He's always talking about the need for this broader revolution. It's always very vague what that means.
Yeah,
but
sure.
the campaign ad that he rolled out yesterday was about power always never comes from above; it always comes from below. And this is this most fundamental point that to me will be central to a successful Bernie Sanders presidency or just the candidacy, which is the creation of these working class movement, broad in the broadest sense, cross racial, multi-gender, etc. That kind of broad working class movement from below that will be able to overcome the structural barriers and the pressure from capital and all of that stuff that's going to come along with him becoming president, and then it will last past his presidency. I mean, I don't think we should be
that
naive.
Would be the logic of it. Yes.
Yeah. I don't think we should be naive about whether or not these you can't say Bernie doesn't matter. What matters is the movement. Like clearly, Bernie is central to creating these kinds of movements. But that building that kind of working class capacity is going to be central to anything that any ability to carry out a social democratic or a socialist or a tepidly liberal even agenda.
No, I totally agree with that, and I that to me is one of his strengths, and that's why for a while it wasn't clear whether he'd run or not, and blah 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 blah. He is an old dude, but that's why I'm actually really glad he's running, because leave aside whoever wins the nomination, whether it's him or somebody else, within the Democratic Party, this is going to be a good barometer of what the strength of left to lefter is in the party, which I'm viewing sort of very broadly and vulgarly at the moment as sort of like Sherrod Brown, who has like a workerist perspective, but is carving out this, I'm not going to go so far as these guys. No, I know. We'll have to do that in part 2. But I'm saying left or leftist. So it's like from him, who unions like. So that's why, the actually existing infrastructure of a liberal left, you have to acknowledge that he's part of that, because unions love the guy. Maybe they shouldn't.
Harrington point right there.
What's that? I'm sorry?
A classic Harringtonian point, Michael.
Yeah, no, it is. It's true. So let's say live left, and then to Warren left, or lefter, I don't know where I am now, and then leftist, at least within this context, Bernie. I want to see, how many votes all of them get. In other words, and more specifically Warren and Sanders. In other words, because that's going to be a good barometer for where this outpouring in the last just few years is at within the Democratic Party in terms of its base support, in terms of like the easiest thing to do, and which even then people don't do it for various reasons, which is to vote as opposed to spend your time actually working and organizing a movement, because you also just have a purely anti-Trumpist kind of liberal movement, but just, hate Trump. He's awful. That's working in the suburbs. That's a big reason why the Dems took back the House of Representatives. So that's going to have its own dynamic with maybe Kamala Harris and Kirsten Gillibrand being part of that. So this with Bernie running, and especially because he's got, he's going to have better staff this time. It's a hard thing to run for president. He knows how to do it now. Obviously, he's going to have a lot of money. Obviously, he's got now 100% name recognition, which is amazing compared to most of America had no idea who this guy was, like in 2016 before he ran. It's going to test where some kind of left is versus right, that other Democratic party. There's what I would say 2 other Democratic parties, meaning a sort of professional center/left Democratic Party of like the DNC and the leadership in Congress and most governors, versus like a farther right Democratic Party of which there's less and less because they keep losing whoever's left of the Southern Dems, some of the Mountain Dems, a conservative Democratic Party. So sort of conservative, centrist, and then this left, which is you lefter, it's dissent, it's Jacobin, ESA, it's it's some pundits, like one for the E.J. Dion, mostly, guys like that. So we'll see. It's Iglesias, believe it or not, who wants massive redistribution. So we'll see. It's some feminists, not other feminists. Some racial justice people. I think most of them, actually, most racial justice people, and a lot of feminists too, I think. So we'll see. We'll be able to measure. In other words, like if you're a feminist and you don't, and whatever, Bernie turns you off, whatever, the Zabor's old man yelling for his corned beef turns you off. You can vote for Warren for whatever reasons. You can vote for her because she proposes a lot of good policies, because she's smart, because, you think it is important to have gender equity and all things being equal, a liberal left woman is good, not just any woman, not Nikki Haley, but, not Margaret Thatcher, but, And so we'll be able to, all the way through, we'll be able to measure, like, the power of left and lefter in the Democratic Party. So it's really important and great that he's running. Like, we'll see what happens. And I think, by the way, any Democratic nominee should beat Trump.
Could be Trump.
Should, could, and I'll even go so far to say probably will.
All right. Well,
including people we would be disappointed by.
I'd love to wrap this thing up, and you throw out a bomb like that. Yeah. We'll have to return.
No, we gotta do it. No, we should do part 2. Because we didn't even get to all this stuff here. Another hour.
It's true. If the people demand it, maybe.
If the people demand.
It's
gotta be a market niche for us, right? I mean, somewhere, right? I mean,
yeah. 2 white guys talking about socialism.
Yeah, whoever heard of that before? I mean, it's gonna be something, right? I mean, not like mass. It's not like Budweiser, some kind of craft brew kind of thing.
Niche market. That's all we ask for.
That's all we want.
Yeah. All right. Well, Rich, this has been a great conversation. Thanks for taking the time to do it, and maybe we'll do it again.
Yeah, that's great, Mike. I'm really glad we did it. All right. Talk to you soon. All right. Bye.